Hi class, this is Susan, and here's your lecture for week 2 of Introductory Philosophy 101 online. So there's going to be 4 different parts to this lecture. We're going to talk about identifying parts of arguments and talking about the difference between inductive and deductive arguments. We're also going to review what we did with the last week, which is about domains of philosophy. And then thirdly, we're going to spend a little bit of time in talking about different forms of fallacious reasoning and how that is problematic and what we can do to spot that in writing and reading and our own thinking. And then finally, just to get everyone ready for the next week where we're starting to read Plato's works, I'm going to give you a little lecturette on a history of the Pre-Socratics. So here we go. So this is a review. Remember that an argument is supporting a belief by giving reasons for accepting the belief. So again, it's not just stating what you believe, but it's clearly identifying the reasons why that belief, you have that belief or someone has that belief. In a philosophical argument, there has to be a conclusion, the point of the argument, what the person is trying to establish. So let's say someone was trying to make the argument that capital punishment is morally wrong. You may or may not have that view, doesn't matter. We're just using this as an example. So say the person's claim or conclusion is that capital punishment is morally wrong. So the question becomes, what are this person's premise or premises, the reasons, beliefs a person uses to support their conclusion? So someone's possible premise is that it is morally wrong to commit murder regardless of the moral character of the person killed. Now, this is not the only option, but you can see this is where the premises are where you really hone in on the thinking process of the speaker. So you could speculate what are some other premises that might support this conclusion. So in the discipline of logic, what we're concerned about is the relationship between the premises and conclusions, not the truth of the premises. So when we're looking at something, so for example, you personally might disagree with this whole argument. But the question is not whether you agree or disagree with the premises of this argument. The point is, does the premise actually support the person's argument? I would say that in this example, it does. So we can also make arguments that aren't necessarily contentious, right? We can make an argument that is not necessarily argumentative in nature. Now, when I bring up something like morals, like capital punishment or abortion or any other number of hot button topics, you'll notice that we get, that puts us into more of an array of emotionality. But I could make an argument about this picture, right? I believe being out in nature is good for the human spirit, because when one is out in nature, like the Grand Canyon, people experience awe and wonder. So, what was my conclusion? What was my premise? I hope you can see that I started with the conclusion and I ended with the premise. So whenever you hear or see because, that's very clearly a very clear premise indicator. But you could create some other argument about this picture. It does actually. I want to go back to that because it makes me happy. Okay. So I have 5 arguments up here. I'm not going to claim that there are good arguments or well-constructed arguments, but every single one of these statements, contains an actual philosophical argument with a premise and a conclusion. So let's see, can you see, since all communists are Marxists, all Marxists are communists? So I don't know if you can see this, but actually the second part of the statement is the conclusion. Because this since is also a premise indicator, okay? Okay, let's go on to number 2. I guess he doesn't have a thing to do. Why else would he waste his time watching daytime TV? So in this case, the conclusion is first. I guess he doesn't have a thing to do. Why else would he waste his time watching daytime TV? Now, I think you can see clearly in this argument, this is a pretty lame argument, right? So there could be a lot of other conclusions for someone spending a lot of time watching daytime TV. You can speculate on that. Number 3, the cat is used to dogs. Probably she won't be upset if you bring home a new dog for a pet. So this is interesting. So what's the conclusion? It's always good to identify the conclusion first. Remember that. You need to identify the conclusion first, and then the premise will follow. So the second statement is the conclusion in this case. This is an inductive argument. Okay, let's go down to the number 4. If the butler had done it, he could not have locked the screen door. Therefore, since the door was locked, we know the butler is in the clear. Okay, this is a classic deductive formulation. The conclusion is simply the last clause of the second sentence. We know the butler is in the clear. And the rest of it are a series of premises. So the first premise is conditional. If the butler had done it, he could have not locked the screen door. The second premise is the door was locked. So therefore, the conclusion is we know the butler is in the clear. So you may not like this. It may seem kind of funny because we don't really know why it is that if the butler had done it, he could not have locked the screen door. We don't have enough information. But the point is, if the truth of these premises would lead to a true conclusion. Okay, and then finally, the Lakers almost didn't beat the Kings. They'll never get past Dallas. So in this example, I don't know if you've spotted it yet, but the second sentence, they'll never get past Dallas, is in fact the conclusion. So what I want you to notice is there's contained in this, the stated premise is that Lakers almost didn't beat the Kings. There's something unstated here. So this is an argument that contains some unstated premises. It has to do with, the relationship between the Kings and Dallas, right? So notice I'm just giving you, and I'll try and put some more examples online so you can test this out. Okay, next topic. So there's 2 main forms of argumentation. There's more variation than this, but one way to look at a standard categorization of argument is to look at the difference between inductive and deductive arguments. In an inductive argument, the truth of the premises is supposed to support some degree of probability that the conclusion is true. So the example I've given here, every raven in a random sample of 3,200 ravens is black. This strongly supports the following conclusion. All ravens are black. So what I want you to notice here is the conclusion is supported by the premise, but it's not absolute. Because you cannot prove an inductive argument to be absolutely true. However, in a deductive argument, the truth of the premises is supposed to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And so a correct deductive argument is valid. So the language of validity and invalidity can really only be associated with deductive arguments. So here's a very clear-cut example. John is taller than Bill, and Bill is taller than Margaret. Therefore, John is taller than Margaret. This is very clear-cut, right? That what you're saying is if John is really taller than Bill, and that's actually true, and Bill is taller than Margaret, it's absolutely true that John is taller than Margaret. So that's very clear-cut. Okay, so I have another 5 examples, and I want you to look at these and determine which ones are inductive arguments and which ones are deductive without seeing. Okay, so I've never met a golden retriever with a nasty disposition. I bet there aren't any. Number 2, since grapes are purple and all grapes are fruit, some fruit is purple. 3, it was the pizza that made my stomach churn. What else could it be? I was fine until I ate it. Mike must belong to the Bartenders and Beverage Union Local 165, since almost every Las Vegas bartender does. And finally, all mammals are warm-blooded creatures, and all whales are mammals. Therefore, all whales are warm-blooded creatures. So I hope that you see here that 1, 3, and 4 are all inductive. There isn't any way that you could absolutely show that the truth of the premises leads to a true conclusion. There's a probability that it could, but it's not absolute. Whereas in 2 and 5, those are deductive arguments because the truth of the premises lead to a true conclusion. Okay. So in last week's lecture, I introduced this idea that there are different domains of and divisions within philosophy. And we've been talking this week mostly about the domain of logic. So all of this stuff about argument identification and analysis really comes down to logic. So now let's move a little further. So what are, we want to be able to distinguish between questions or statements related to metaphysics, which is the nature of reality, questions or statements that deal with, that are epistemological, in which case it deals with how we know things, and those that come from the domain of values, which can include everything from morals and ethics to political philosophy and aesthetics. Okay, so I have 8 statements here, and so we can never know absolute truth. The nature of reality is unified. Killing is morally wrong. Ask not what you can do for what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It's a famous JFK quote. We cannot know the difference between dreaming and waking. Time has no beginning or end. Humans should never lie. Heaven is not real. So, in the first statement, we can never know absolute truth. The tip-off word is no. This is a tip-off that this is an epistemological concern. The nature of reality is unified. The tip-off is, it is the nature of reality, so therefore it's a metaphysical question or statement. killing is morally wrong. Number 3 and 4, I think you could probably see pretty clearly are related to values. We cannot know the difference between dreaming and waking. Oh, I hope you said epistemological. Time has no beginning or end. That's a metaphysical statement. Humans should never lie. Sounds like values. Heaven is not real. That's a metaphysical claim. Okay, now we have common fallacies. We have common fallacies related to argumentum ad hominem, an idea that one can challenge an argument by criticizing or attacking the person who made that argument. So here's the thing. These fallacies are ways in which people distort arguments and try and manipulate people through emotion or faulty reasoning. So another way to look at fallacies are their forms of faulty reasoning. And you may have encountered a discussion of this in some other class. I hope you have. So an argumentum ad hominem is basically that means argument to the man. And it is an idea that you can challenge an argument by criticizing or attacking the person who made that argument. So it's an attack against the speaker. We can see this often in politics. Appeals to emotion. Any attempt to make an argument by playing on the emotions of the listener. You know, you're un-American if you don't support the actions of the president. You're an appeal to national loyalty, an appeal to pity, an appeal to anger. Any kind of argument that you're trying to make, which is designed to sway the listener by emotion, is an appeal to emotion. This is common, an argument from popularity, believing that if everybody believes it, it must be true. Okay, begging the question. This is the most difficult one to identify, and people often use the statement that begs the question incorrectly. So, begging the question, another way to look at this, it's really circular argumentation. And that is where the premise you create relies on assumption that is very similar to your conclusion. So they're so close, they're almost the same thing. So here's a classic one. I believe in God, therefore God exists. Now someone could make that claim, that's fine, but it's not a good argument from the standpoint of logic. It's a circular reasoning, right? So, okay, a black or white fallacy is also called either or all or nothing. So it's like making things seem as if it's only two-sided. It's either A or B. An argument that assumes only two conclusions and ignores the possibility of a third conclusion or a fourth conclusion or a fifth conclusion. Okay, this is a common one, and it's actually talked about in the discipline of sociology quite a bit, groupthink. And this is the phenomena where you allow your loyalty to the group to cloud one's judgment. So classic example is you're sitting with a group of people, like say on a committee meeting, and you have a different point of view than the rest of the group, but you don't want to say anything for fear of looking different. So this is actually a huge problem in human groups in society. It's said that the Space Shuttle Challenger mission that went down in, I think it was 1985, maybe before your time, I don't know, but it was caused because a group of engineers who were analyzing the mission before it took place, at least one or two of them didn't speak up about the problems they thought were going to happen. Okay, this is one I'm sure you have engaged in, because I know I have. And that is hasty generalization or jumping to conclusion. And that is having more confidence in a conclusion than you should based on a small sample. So, for example, assuming the worst. Your significant other is texting your best friend, and you assume the worst, that they're having an affair, when in fact they're planning a surprise party for you. This is based on a true story. Okay. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. So sometimes, and this is like improper correlation. So like the example before, the inductive argument about the person whose stomach was churning, and they assumed that it was because they ate the pizza. This is actually a common thing in medical science, that people assume that because something happened right after eating something, it had to be caused by the eating of the something. And that's actually not necessarily true. Okay. A red herring. I love this one. It is addressing an issue which is off the topic of the argument. So it's like a distraction. So a red herring is a stinky fish. And this is the idea that sometimes when asked a question, you can see this quite often in politics and, political campaigns, when people in the campaign, for whatever race, it's running for governor, state senator, et cetera, they're asked a question, and rather than answering the question directly, they bring up another topic altogether, and that is a red herring. A straw man. A straw man, this is a little bit more challenging. A straw man is actually misrepresenting the views of the person you are refuting. So it is saying something about the person's views that you're refuting that's actually incorrect. Wishful thinking, a lot of that going around these days. A refusal to acknowledge the truth. And you can also call it the ostrich fallacy. Okay, so last little identification thing. So we have got 6 statements here, and I'm just going to let you look at it for a second. So you might want to pause the video. Okay, that would be a good idea. And just jot down what you think each of these fallacies are. Okay, I'm going to tell you, it's possible that there's more than one fallacy for each of these. But I'm going to tell you what I thought of when I picked these, all right? So just because you chose something else doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. But I just want to explain to you my thinking and why I used these examples to illustrate certain fallacies. Okay, cast your vote for Patterson. She deserves to win the election because she's never won anything. That's a classic appeal to emotion. So trying to play on pity. Okay, number 2. This one is a little bit trickier. Your argument that there's too much violence on television doesn't hold water. Why, just look at the great kid shows. There's Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street. Those shows are great. This argument is a red herring. The existence of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street does not disprove or prove that there's too much violence on television. Okay? So, just a distraction. Number 3, the reason I know abortion is wrong is because I know murder is wrong. This is a circular argument. Evil exists. Either evil exists or there is no explanation for Hitler and Nazi Germany. This is a classic either or. You have to agree with me or not. Don't read Nietzsche. He died of syphilis, and his works were read to promote the Nazi agenda. This is an argumentum ad hominem. And then finally, Preston says that the idea that you are sitting as I have a word missing here, sorry about that. Sitting at a desk is really just an idea held by the ultimate observer. I say Preston is wrong because I can feel the desk and it has a smooth surface. Now, you may not know this, but this idea of Preston's that says the desk you're sitting at is really just an idea held by the ultimate observer, is in fact a classic philosophical argument from the Irish philosopher George Berkeley. And so in this case, this is a straw man. So the speaker who is saying Preston is wrong is misrepresenting the argument, Preston's argument. So this is a straw man. Okay, hope you're having fun. I know I'm talking a lot. Okay, now to our last part of the lecture. So Homer was a poet historian from the 8th century B.C.E. So just remember that Greek philosophy is the origin of the conversation about Western philosophy. So even though we will touch a little bit in this course on Eastern philosophy a little bit later in the course, what we're primarily doing here is tracing the ideas of Western philosophy historically. So these stories from Homer were the basis of ideas about what humans should aspire to, right? And the basic questions of society and civilization started with the works of Homer in the West. So what we see is that around the end of 498 BCE in Athens, the city-states of Iona and Sparta halted the movement of the Persian Empire and gave rise to stability and growth of Athenian democracy. So once we have relative stability, we can see through this time period that actually is when Greek philosophy is fomenting, or growing. So we need to understand that Greek mythology actually does play a role in our conversations about philosophy. First, it's important to know, especially before you read the defense of Socrates, to know what Socrates was being accused of. So there is this complex relationship between mythology and philosophy. So philosophers were trying to say that rational ideas, or the logos, was separated from mythical ideas, or the mythos, but they didn't deny the existence of gods. They were kind of walking a fine line because people believed in the existence of gods. Greek mythology also has important links in modern philosophical thought to the works of Freud and Nietzsche. You'll see this come up when we talk about Nietzsche later on in the course. Okay, so we're going to look at a series of philosophers in this last bit who were from the Greek Isles. And this period of time, all of these people in this little lecturette are called Pre-Socratics. They were philosophers in Greece before the advent and the time of Socrates and Plato. So here's Thales, and he and two others were called They were Milesians, and they were asking a basic metaphysical question. What is the basic stuff of the universe? What makes up the universe? Thales said it was water. Another one of his colleagues, Anaximenes, said it was air. Anaximander said it was Hyperion, or material stuff that is neutral, boundless, indefinite, and indeterminate. So remember, there's no discipline of science or scientific inquiry. This is the beginning parts of this. They're asking, what's the basic stuff? What's the universe made of? So you might recognize this name, Pythagoras. Pythagoras, according to Aristotle, Pythagoras held that everything is composed of numbers. According to his wife, Theano, Pythagoras held that everything is in accordance with numbers. So without trying to resolve the differences in these two different arguments, it's clear that Pythagoras introduced the view that reality involves things that are immaterial, perfect, unchanging, and known only by reason. So you might notice that Pythagoras is tapping into the rationality and logic of and universality of the language of mathematics. Okay, here's my favorite. I do have favorites. Heraclitus. Heraclitus and Parmenides, who are around the same time. So Heraclitus said that the only thing we can know about reality is that it's always changing. It's always in flux. Which is actually what modern science says. But Heraclitus is saying this in Greece, in the Greek Isles, actually around the same time as the Buddha. And the Buddha said the same thing. One of the only things we can say about reality, it's always changing. And I find it fascinating that two different philosophers in two different locations were saying essentially the same thing at the same time. But Heraclitus was different from the Buddha in that he claimed that all change is governed by the logos, which is the rational principle that underlies the unity of opposites. Okay, and realize that even though in the minds of the Greek philosophers, logos is a rational principle, it's also becomes later on identified with God in Christian theology and also early Jewish Neoplatonism. Okay, Parmenides. He was kind of, as opposed to Heraclitus, who was really observing the nature of reality. So Heraclitus is one of our only sort of more empirical, it's sort of a combination of empirical and rational philosophers. Parmenides used an a priori method of inquiry, which would mean that he had a rational epistemology. He held that reality is one, eternal, perfect, and unchanging. So we also have Empedocles and Anaxagoras. So Empedocles said that everything is made of different combinations of earth, air, fire, and water particles. The particles themselves never change, only their arrangements do. What does this sound like? Anaxagoras. For each kind of observable substance, there is a corresponding kind of particle. Wow. Each particle is infinitely divisible. There's a little of everything in everything. Again, these are ideas that predate modern chemistry and physics. So it's interesting that these people are just thinking about the world and predicting things that will be explored later on. Very interesting. You see sort of the roots of the questions about reality start here in ancient Greece. Okay, so now I'm throwing a lot of names at you. I don't expect you to memorize all these names, but I want you to see some of the trends here. I would like you to know about Heraclitus and Pythagoras. Democritus, I'm always like, I'm not totally sure about my accents on his name, so don't quote me on how I pronounced his name. I've worked out the other ones. Okay. The Atomists, they were saying that all things are composed of atoms. Atoms are tiny and imperceptible, indestructible and indivisible, eternal and uncreated, infinitely numerous and eternal in motion, materially identical, different in size and shape, completely determined by physical laws of motion. So notice here, I'll just say this, notice here, again, we have this claim about the nature of reality, right? Which is a metaphysical enterprise. And at the same time, there's an implied epistemology, which seems to be both empirical and rational in the case of the atomists. Okay, so this is the final slide of this lecturette. So notice that there's some common pre-Socratic themes. And one of them is there's an underlying reality that is that's different from the way things look. So there's a distinction between what we see in the observable world and the way things really are. The second understanding is that the Pre-Socratics were primarily not skeptics. They believed that the underlying reality is knowable. Right? So that implies something about their epistemology. So they were also kind of the first to say reality is best understood by depersonalizing it, so mythological explanations and accounts should be avoided or rejected. So thank you for your kind attention. Ask me questions. These are some of my references. So I referenced lots of different texts for this lecture.